Hi, I'm Russ Adams. I'm with the Alliance for Metropolitan Stability. I'll be your instructor on community benefits agreements. I'm looking forward to our discussion. Okay, so let's get started. In front of you is an image of a community organizing campaign that our organization was involved in back in 2004, 2005, when community groups were starting to look at the planning diagrams and maps for what was then called the Central Corridor LRT project. It's now called the Green Line. And the inset picture is a question that we had at the table. This was at the Rondo Days event, and asked a very simple question: where do you live? Where do you think LRT stops should be located? This was a community benefits type of campaign for us, in the sense that community members looked at where station stops were going to be on the light rail line and realized that where they would put the push pins in terms of where they think stops should be along University Avenue were not the locations that city and Met Council planners were looking at. So sometimes asking the right question is the first step in the community benefits process. Now we're going to break down what community benefits agreements are. One theme that you'll want to keep in mind is the way that the community benefits agreements and the conversations that go on, the dialogue and negotiations, link public investments with community needs. That's the common denominator, is looking at public subsidies and public investments and how well they serve the public interest. Okay, so these next two slides are actually part of your reading for the handout that's entitled, What is a Community Benefit Agreement? So we borrowed these few paragraphs because they do a great job of setting the table for what a community benefits agreement is, what's in it, what's the purpose of it, how do they function. So we'll go quickly through this, but it's important to understand that we're tying the community demands to public dollars that are being invested in some kind of project. The public subsidy can take many, many forms. Usually we think of it as if you think of a stadium, there's a public contribution of millions and millions of dollars in that project. But it doesn't always look like direct money. It could be zoning considerations. It could be tax abatements or tax increment financing. It could be help with gutters and sewer lines and other infrastructure, parking ramps. It takes many, many forms. And we're going to get into that and even show you one surprising example of a public subsidy that didn't always meet the first look in terms of folks examining what was going on. So we'll get into that, but it's very important to think about this as these are our dollars, these are public investments, and therefore the community has a right to have some expectations of benefits from that development. Now, in the Twin Cities metro area, many community groups have started to look to the community benefits agreement as an organizing tool to structure what are some of the community concerns and to use a filter to see new developments coming into our community. How do those meet our goals for addressing community concerns? And one of the things that we'd like to argue is that these projects should not just benefit the owner of the property, they should help lift people out of poverty in the surrounding community. Okay, this next slide just basically breaks down what a CBA is, what form it takes, the kinds of negotiations that are necessary to pull it off, how the public sector and public officials can be very supportive, as well as what might go into a CBA. We're going to go into detail. You'll see some of this language in the PowerPoint slide presentation later on, so I won't spend much time on it. But this slide and the previous slide is a good basic primer on what we're talking about. This is a diagram. It's some animation for you. What this looks at is the typical conversation that goes on when a developer comes into a city and wants to build something. And typically what happens is a conversation that goes on that excludes neighborhood and community-based groups. So the developer might say to a city planning department, I own a particular property at this address, and this is what I want to do with it, but it's tough to do development in your city, and I need some assistance from you. And the city will usually say, okay, we're desperate for development, jobs, and tax base, so whatever you need. And the community wonders whether they're ever going to be a part of the conversation. Will they be at the decision-making table, or will it all be after the fact, and that they'll be in the reactive mode instead of helping to be proactive to see how a development is going to serve their needs? So in community benefit agreement work, we typically will look at a project and ask a simple question: who decides and who benefits from this project? And that's a good rule of thumb to apply in most development cases. And we're not just going to look at pure development scenarios where a developer wants to build something in a city. We'll look at a couple of alternatives to that too. So let's break down what a community benefit agreement is. We're going to give you 4 simple rules of thumb about a community benefits agreement. The first one is these campaigns link public investments directly to community needs. That's that theme we mentioned before. These campaigns allow neighborhood-based organizations to take a larger role in local development decisions. So it's a way of elevating the voice of community members and reinforcing the fact that their opinions matter. And every image you're going to see in this slide are taken from actual neighborhood or community coalitions focused on one development or another, in this case the Harrison neighborhood and the Van White station stop on the Southwest LRT line. Now, we want to also remember that we're saying agreement. A community benefit agreement is a binding contract in its purest form, typically between a developer and a neighborhood group. The agreement you're seeing in front of you was between Common Bond Communities, a nonprofit housing developer, and Union Park District Council, one of the neighborhood associations in St. Paul. And there are a lot of different forms to adopt for an agreement. This one is pretty standard in terms of identifying the parties and the project. Now, I said it's a legally enforceable contract. Traditionally, that's what a community benefit agreement is, and it's entered upon by community groups and a developer, and it sets forth a range of expectations, strategic investments, and equitable outcomes. There are provisions for compliance with the agreement, remedies for noncompliance, even mediation envisioned to try to work through disagreements. I always say to community groups, the last thing you want to do is end up in court suing the developer for breach of the contract, because that gets incredibly expensive. You want to build a community benefit agreement that is flexible, that recognizes sometimes things don't go as planned in a development during construction or afterwards, and you want to have the flexibility to adapt and adjust the understanding and terms within reason. But in the end, if you can't, it's always best to have that binding agreement as a way to resolve the differences. Next slide is item number 3 in terms of these themes. It's a direct result of negotiations between the developer and organized representatives of affected communities, often with the support of local public officials. The strongest community benefit agreements tend to be with community groups that are powerful, or coalitions that are powerful, that have the attention of the elected governmental official, and they are on your side. So a certain amount of good community organizing is needed to do successful community benefits negotiations. These negotiations shape the project in ways that deliver specific benefits for the community. Implementation, continued communication, and negotiations. This is just an example of the community benefit agreement between Common Bond and Union Park District Council in terms of compliance and review and meetings. You certainly want to continuously monitor the project and have reporting, regular reporting meetings to see what the progress is or what the obstacles encountered are. And fourth and finally, it's important to understand that in a community benefit agreement, in exchange for that agreement, the developer makes a pledge to address the community concerns that were surfaced in community meetings, identified, and structured into the agreement. So the developer pledges to address those concerns, and in exchange, the community group agrees to officially support the project. In places like Minneapolis and St. Paul, neighborhood associations can have a lot of power over developments. So can the city council member. They have a lot of power to veto a project they don't like. And so working together, the community groups and the elected officials can shape and define some aspects of development as proposed in their community. This is the Longfellow community on the left, and Lexington Commons, which was the result of that Common Bond UPDC community benefit agreement. The Longfellow community example we're about to get into, so I won't go into that right now. Okay, so responsibilities of each party. Again, like any good contract, legal contract, CBA is going to lay out what the expectations and responsibilities are of the parties. Now, let's go back to that diagram of typically the kind of conversation that happens at City Hall when a developer comes into town and wants to do something. You've got the city, and this again is an animated slide. You've got the city, the developer, you have the neighborhood and community-based groups, but this is the CBA model. So it's going to unfold a little differently. The developer says, I own this property, and here's how I plan to meet the neighborhood association's vision for our community. So he or she is not saying, this is what I want to do, and that's it. They are recognizing that there's more than one party and set of interests involved in this, and that they've done their homework. They know what the neighborhood vision for the area is. The city, if it's operating with equitable outcomes in mind, will say, great, but have you met with the community? You want city development agencies asking that question. You want city council members asking that question. And ideally, the neighborhood informs them and says, yes, we've been meeting. We've had a series of negotiations. We've drafted up an agreement and held public meetings about it. Would you like to see our CBA? And we want both the developer and the neighborhood groups or community-based groups or community coalitions saying that. Now, list of expectations, demands, outcomes, needs that are identified in public meetings. This is just a sample of the kinds of things you might see listed out in a community benefit agreement. They run the gamut from physical design to actual focus on what kind of jobs are going to be generated, both the construction of the development and the permanent jobs on site. Certainly housing affordability is a pretty standard topic when we're talking about residential development. And there's a whole list of other ones, some environmental and sustainable development focused, others getting creative with the actual space and looking at whether there's opportunities to allow for neighborhood groups to meet on site for free, and even in some cases developing entrepreneurial opportunities and encouraging business development of local mom and pop businesses. Remember, the hallmark of a CBA is the exchange, the mutual benefit, the understanding that with the developer's cooperation, concessions are made, modifications are made by the developer. There's a willingness on their part to sign a legally binding agreement. And in exchange for that, the community groups agree to support the project and show up at city council meetings, show up at planning committee meetings, and speak in favor of the project, even if there is some neighborhood opposition. Even if people turn out and say, I don't want to see more affordable housing in my neighborhood. I'm worried about this project. I'm worried about traffic counts. I'm worried about unsupervised children. I'm worried about this or that. So you have to do your homework. You have to be really clear that on balance, the development will have a positive impact on the community, because a community benefits coalition may not have 100% agreement from even the neighbors on a development. Now, there are a couple of different models for gaining agreements and actually securing impacts that are positive, and getting different agencies and entities to take your demands seriously. So we've gone over the community benefits agreement. There are other ways to elevate these kinds of concerns, focusing in on city vendor contracting. A city like Minneapolis enters into vendor contracts, probably spends millions, tens of millions of dollars every year on various contracting. How many of those contracts are going to disadvantaged business enterprises, women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses, veterans, and people with disabilities? So there's other places to look, not just a physical development project to try to elevate community benefits. There are models that stop short of having a legally binding agreement. So you, instead of having a CBA, you might only be able to negotiate with the project and the city something like a memorandum of understanding, or maybe a community compact. I'm not going to go into what those are, except to say those are not legally binding. So it's another way to organize the community concerns and to surface good faith agreements that all parties will try their best to address those impacts. But it's not legally binding, so if they fall short, you can't take them to court. This is an example of a community summit that was done on the Central Corridor project. 3 additional station stops were secured after much organizing, years of organizing around the fact that the planners were ignoring areas that were transit dependent, that had large populations of people of color, that were low wealth communities. But the community groups didn't stop only at securing those station stops. They wanted also to draw up a whole list of concerns and additional features and outcomes that they wanted to see, and that was a community compact model. Also want to point out that community benefits can be written into city resolutions, local ordinances, and even into local comprehensive plans. An example of that is the Harrison Neighborhood's Bassett's Creek Valley Master Plan, which envisions redevelopment of an area that includes the city's impound lot and the current concrete crushing facility. This is along the Cedar Lake Bicycle Trail, if you're familiar with Minneapolis. This architectural drawing is looking east towards downtown Minneapolis from the Harrison neighborhood, from the Cedar Lake Bike Trail, the future corridor for Southwest LRT, the Van White Station stop there. So the Harrison neighborhood did a very sophisticated campaign of putting pressure on the developer who won the exclusive development rights to develop this LRT station, and this is city-owned property. So the other advantage that Harrison has is site control is always an issue, and in this case, it's controlled by a public entity. Great opportunity to elevate community benefits and get requirements built into any exclusive development right understandings and contracts. And one last example. I said I wasn't going to go into too much detail, but these are some examples that are alternatives to a community benefits agreement, is the Baltimore Red Line Community Compact. This was a compact fashioned by community groups, resident leaders, city officials, and county and state agencies building an extension to the light rail system in Baltimore, in this case the Red Line, and that it had a whole number of categories of improvements that people were looking for. Again, not legally binding, but the trust level was strong enough that people felt comfortable moving forward with the community compact. Okay, now we're going to take a look at a couple of examples in the Twin Cities, and then we're going to be done with the presentation part, and we'll have more discussion about this stuff in class. How has the CBA model worked in the Twin Cities? First example is the very first CBA that was signed by a Minneapolis neighborhood group for the Perina Mills development site. If you ride the Hiawatha Light Rail line as you approach 38th Street Station, on the east side you'll see a number of grain silos. These are zoned in the long term to be something other than heavy industrial property. Eventually these are going to be zoned mixed TOD, kind of residential and commercial retail. It's sort of a depressing site when you ride the Hiawatha or the Blue Line along Hiawatha right now. There has not been as much development in some sections, in the midsection of it, as people would like, and there's a plan by the city to change that. Well, one of the first examples of that was the Perina Mills development site. The developer, who grew up in the Longfellow neighborhood, was open to negotiating with the Longfellow Community Council a series of outcomes and benefits for the project, and they did manage to secure a CBA, a binding agreement, despite the protestations of the developer's lawyers and his bankers. He did sign the development. They were concerned that meeting some of the demands of the neighborhood would add undue costs to the project. This is a short list of some of the outcomes that were negotiated. And before we leave that slide, also want to point out that the developer kind of went belly up on his development when the housing market collapsed. The investors in his project got 50 cents on the dollar. A different development firm stepped in on the project, a nonprofit developer, and agreed to complete the project. Did not agree to sign the CBA document, but pledged to try to meet as many of the provisions as he could in the development of it. That project now is completed, and it is the first residential development at that area, 38th Street Station, kitty corner to the it's on the other side of Hiawatha, so it's across the highway from it. Okay, here's an example of a community benefit agreement campaign that focused not on a development project but on a vendor contract. In 2005, the city of Minneapolis started to consider and put out a request for proposals for businesses to build what they described as a ubiquitous high-speed broadband coverage strategy using Wi-Fi signals. This was kind of new technology back at that time, and there was no one place where this was going to be developed. It's not at one intersection. It's not along one corridor. It's the entire city of Minneapolis. And when they came down to the finalists, they had two bids to choose from, and the bidders were instructed to look at some of the ideas that had surfaced in community conversations about community benefits. The city staff were instructed to pick the contractor who did the best job of meeting the community benefits requirements. So we had two contractors trying to outbid each other, and we got several good outcomes out of this vendor contract process. You're seeing some that are listed here. Typically, when there's a community benefit agreement, the leverage tool that community groups use is the public subsidy, and we probably should have talked about that earlier in the presentation. Public subsidies take many forms, for development projects. They could be direct dollar subsidy. So think of the Viking Stadium in that case, where the owner of the Vikings isn't paying the full tab for a stadium. They could be zoning variances. They could be tax increment financing schemes or tax abatement. They could take other forms of assistance. Any form of assistance, we would argue, is a public subsidy. So in the case of the Minneapolis Wi-Fi contract, it wasn't apparent to the eye immediately what the public subsidy would be, and therefore the leverage point for community benefits. But the city council members knew what it was, and that is the Wi-Fi vendor was looking for the access to a public right-of-way to set up their transmitter and receiver boxes. You see an image of one right now. If we pulled back from that image, you'd see that they're attaching that to a light pole, which is owned by the city. That's the public right-of-way. That is the public subsidy. That's the leverage point for requiring that in exchange for access to this right-of-way, you will put in some community benefits. We can talk more about this in class. The agreement was conceived in joint discussions between Minneapolis and advisory committees, and the benefit requirements were inserted into the contract and vendor selection process. Union Park District Council, you've already seen sample language from that. It was an affordable housing development. There was substantial neighborhood opposition to adding more affordable housing, and in this case, the community benefit agreement created some political will and backing for the project. So the neighborhood group was able to go back to their leaders in the neighborhood who had expressed concerns about this project and to say, we have pretty strong agreements about the management of the project, the exterior design, landscaping, traffic, parking, and we even have some local hiring and other provisions that we want. Emerson North Housing Development is another example. This is the fourth example. And this was a community benefit agreement process and negotiations between the Northside Residents Redevelopment Council, NERC, and the Plymouth Church Neighborhood Foundation. Plymouth is a affordable housing developer. It's faith-based. And again, there was some neighborhood opposition to adding affordable housing in the community. So the CBA served as a way to placate some local resistance and concern and get very deliberate and intentional about what outcomes and expectations were going to come out of the project, including a very ambitious hiring goal for the estimated 100 people who would help build the affordable housing development project. And here's our final example. Hennepin County built a social services hub in North Minneapolis and was willing to discuss community benefits outcomes with NERC, the neighborhood association on the north side, and the developer, the Ackerberg Group. And they had a series of areas that were identified that should be rolled into a community benefit. The important thing to see here is, again, pretty ambitious hiring goals for the construction of the project, as well as women and minority contracting goals. And they had signs out during construction telling the community, tracking how well they were doing, what were the actual results, what were the original goals. So you can see that in that image. And the other documents I'm going to show you here are the ways that the developer and the county and the neighborhood group tracked the workforce hours for the hiring goals. And in the next slide, the women and minority contracting. They had regular reports, monthly reports during the construction season to track that. It's very important to be tracking and monitoring progress on goals. So that completes the 5 examples of how this has taken place in the Twin Cities. You have a before and a artist's conception of after. I should probably put in a new image there because that project is done and it's up and running. Of course, it is 2015 now. I'm talking to you in late 2014. But this completes the CBA presentation. We can have, I hope, a robust and provocative conversation about the advantages of this approach and the challenges and difficulties of trying to implement it. Thank you.